Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Hello, my name is Jackie Schimmel. I'm the host of the BitchBible Podcast. If you've never listened to the BitchBible Podcast, I genuinely feel terrible for you. Because up until this moment, you haven't really been living or experiencing true, untethered, unhinged, morally flexible joy infiltrating your ear canals on a weekly basis. The good news is, there's still time for you, Katie. Buckle up, Buttercup, because I'm about to take you on a real bender for pop culture musings, aggressive social commentary, both piping hot and barely lukewarm takes, plus charisma for days. Make sure you listen to the BitchBible Podcast because objectively and unbiasedly, in my very humble opinion, it's the best podcast you will ever listen to. You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll guffaw, you'll be appalled. And guess what, Katie? You'll just keep coming back for more. So go listen to the BitchBible Podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. You're welcome.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey guys, whether you love true crime or comedies, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance. Then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options.
Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our look at the Robert Wone case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my Minwadizi co-host, Alice.
Wow, Brett, we've been doing this for like 3 years. I actually have no concept of how long we've been doing this podcast, but few words make me raise my eyebrows, and that was really good. No idea what you said. Hope it wasn't homely again, but
it wasn't.
Thank you for saying that.
That means you are a good, honest person.
Oh.
And Sophie shared that with us. I'm not entirely sure what language it is.
Sophie's
Maybe Sophie
word gets used.
Can let us know what language it is. But I did the best I could. Sophie sent me some pronunciation guides and everything, and I actually tried to get it right. I have no idea how to pronounce the language she just sent in the chat that it is.
It's beautiful.
Ojibwe?
I will say,
Ojibwe.
I think you've been overlooking Sophie's very many descriptors. So let it be known that on this 4th year of the podcast, Brett has broken down the wall of Sophieisms.
Better late than never. Okay. Well, we are back to continue our discussion of the Robert Wone case. And I know, Alice, you're really excited about this one. We started talking about this last time, and it is a case that you can't help but get sucked into. I know a lot of you have watched the documentary, you've started reading about this case, and what we've heard from you is that you have found it to be just as amazing as we did. So we're really excited to continue with this timeline as we try and figure out exactly what happened that day in Washington, D.C. So Alice, with no further ado, why don't you take us away?
Absolutely. So last time we left off with the timeline, and we left off at about 12:25 when Robert was pronounced dead at George Washington University Hospital at just 32 years old. Things get moving pretty quickly that night. So now we're into the early morning of the next day. The 3 men who were in the house with Robert when he died were Zaborski, Price, and Ward. All 3 of them, as you can imagine, were transported to the Metropolitan Police Department that morning, and each interviewed separately about the prior night's events. Zaborski reported to police that he came home early from a business trip and discovered that Robert would be spending the night at their home. He told police he did not see Robert that night because he was already in bed when Robert arrived. He and his partner, Joe Price, remember, they're the ones who shared the master bedroom on the 3rd floor of the townhome. He said the 2 of them were in bed asleep, and they woke up to what Victor Zaborski described as a kind of low scream or low breathy grunts. So the 2 of them ran downstairs to see what was going on and discovered Robert, quote, injured in the bed in the guest room. Now, he confirmed that he did not hear anyone running around the house, but he also said he would have expected to be able to hear someone running down the steps to the 1st floor if they were doing so. Price then instructed Zaborski to go upstairs back to their room to call 911.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about this story that he tells and that sort of jumps out to you immediately is this notion that they hear this low scream and then they're heading downstairs. And it sounds like, from the way he tells the story, there's not a lot of time between when they hear that and when they start to head downstairs. But they don't see anybody. They don't see anybody running away. They don't hear anybody running away. There's no evidence of an intruder other than this sound which woke them up. And just recall, the scream, or a scream, which we presume to be the same scream, was heard by the next door neighbors. The next door neighbors reported hearing a scream. Now, as Alice said, the walls on these places aren't exactly thick. You know, you can hear sounds, but you would expect that any sound that the next door neighbors heard, the people just upstairs would hear just as well. So, number one, this scream is described in a strange way. It's not described as a loud, piercing scream, which is kind of what you would expect if the next door neighbors are going to hear it as well. It's this low scream and low, breathy grunts, like whatever that means. And it's just a little unclear to me how that could be what you heard, but not hear anything else from the person who supposedly was in the apartment with you at that same time and would have rushed out. And remember another thing. From where this person was, if they're in that room where Robert was, it's not like they can go out of his room and straight down the stairs. They could have done that if they were in the other bedroom on the 2nd floor, but not from where Robert was. They would have to go around and down the stairs. So just already, the scene as it's being described to us just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, we touched upon this last time, but this is, one of those 100-year-old row houses. And at the time, the floorboards did creak. Brett, you lived in the DC area. I lived in 3 different row homes in DC in different parts of, very close to DuPont Circle, Columbia Heights, up in Mount Pleasant by the zoo. All 3 of them were built around the same time as this particular row house, and all of them had the world's creakiest floorboards, right? There was no sneaking around. I had a German Shepherd at the time, which I personally appreciated because she was my security alarm. But when she got up in the middle of the night to walk over across the room to get some water, it woke everybody up. She was an 85-pound dog. Someone who is, an intruder is likely to be even heavier than an 85-pound German Shepherd. And this is the key part. It's that Zaborski himself recognizes that he's lived in this home and he would normally hear someone walking around, probably in a quickened fashion. Once you stab someone, you don't saunter your way around the hallway, down the steps, out the door. But he hears none of that. And this is especially interesting because he chooses to describe what woke him up as low and grunty. What that sounds to me like is not screams, high-pitched, high decibels, but rather something that you have to kind of strain to hear. And that low of a sound is what he's describing wakes him up, which probably means it's close in time to the attack, if in fact what he's describing really happened. Meaning, since stab wounds are very personal and very close to someone, you have to be close in proximity to someone to stab them. And when you pull out the knife, you're still close in proximity to them. There's some amount of time that takes to walk down the hall, walk down the stairs, out whatever entrance that person used to escape. But here we have no indication that Victor heard any of these other noises that would have indicated there was an intruder.
And look, to a certain extent, we're really picking apart what Zaborski said. And sometimes that's kind of a recipe for a disaster because people say things in a strange way. They don't necessarily describe things very well, particularly when they're under a lot of stress. And I want to just give him all that grace that it could just all be that. And we may be focusing on this a little bit too much. But even the description of what he heard doesn't sound like something that necessarily, when you have another person in the house who could be moving around, could be watching television, could be doing any number of things down there, would make me run out of my room and down the stairs as if there is something that I must immediately address. It just, I don't know, it just doesn't strike me as the kind of, this is an emergency, you need to get down there right now, at least the way he describes it. But it may just be that his descriptions are a little off. So they've talked to Zaborski. Now they're going to talk to Price, to Joe Price. And his statement is very similar to Zaborski's, which you would expect. I mean, they were together, so if this happened, you would expect their story would be very similar. Now, he adds that when he discovers Robert, he saw that the knife was laying on his stomach, which already is strange. This description of, you imagine Robert, who's been stabbed 3 times. Those are the only wounds on him. Those are the wounds that are going to cause his death. And as we said, the stab wounds in some ways are almost like dainty because they don't go the full length of the knife all the way into his body. They're very clean. They're almost surgical. Just stabbed in, pulled out, stabbed in, pulled out, stabbed in, pulled out, and then apparently, according to Joe, at least initially, the knife laid gently on Robert's stomach. That's what he's telling us he initially sees. And what does he do? So Alice and I had the opportunity to go speak to a school recently. Great group of kids, high school kids. They're going to rule the world one day. And I used the example of Murder, She Wrote, which, as I told them, was a dated reference for anybody who's 16 years old. But I said, maybe you watched it with your grandparents or something. But what always happened in Matlock, Murder, She Wrote, Perry Mason, if you go back that far, is people, they walk into the room, they see somebody dead, the knife is sticking out of them or laying on the ground, and what is the first thing they do? They reach down and pick it up. And you're always like, what are you doing? Or they pull the knife out. It's like, what are you doing? And of course, the next thing that happens is the door opens and the police come in and they find them standing with a knife over the body. And that's how everyone starts. Well, what you know, in this case, that's exactly what happens. Joe goes in, he sees the knife laying on Robert's stomach. And what does he do? He picks it up and he puts it on the nightstand. That's the story he initially tells. But later on, he'll tell the police, you know what? That wasn't true. That's not actually what happened. What actually happened was the knife was still in Robert's chest. And what does he do? He pulls the knife out of his chest and then puts it on the nightstand. And this is one of those things that, as we often say, we don't like to put a whole lot of stock in behavior and what people do because people do weird things. But whenever I hear somebody say, if there are any fingerprints on the blade, it's probably because I did this really dumb thing and pulled the knife out of their chest. It always makes me immediately suspicious. I don't know, Alice. Maybe this is the first thing you would do if you found a body.
No, absolutely not. I would not do that.
Yeah, and I just, once again, the problem with this case, as we're going to see again and again, is so much of it depends on the credibility of the only witnesses you have, which are the 3 people who are living in this home. And when you hear stuff like this, it immediately makes you think you cannot trust these people. But nevertheless, so that's what he's now saying. So he pulled the knife out, put it on the nightstand. Now, both Price and Zaborski said they didn't see Dylan Ward emerge from his bedroom until after they had already discovered Robert. So they hear this breathy scream. They hear these weird sounds. They rush down. What do they not do? They don't immediately run to their roommate's room and see, is he okay? They immediately run into Robert's room. Then after they do that, their roommate apparently comes out. And Ward says that he didn't wake up because he didn't hear any of this screaming. He didn't hear anybody walking around until he heard the commotion of Price and Zaborski when they're finding Robert in bed.
And this is really interesting, right? Because we have Joe and Victor who say that they're actually completely asleep at this time, are up a staircase. Now, granted, their room is at the top of the staircase, and if you fell down the stairs, basically you'd kind of fall into the guest room. But they're still on a different floor. They heard the low grunts that woke them up. Yet the closest in proximity to Robert, Dylan, who's just steps away, the only thing in between them are not staircases and another floor, but rather a door, right? Maybe 2 doors, maybe Robert's door and Dylan's door. And he did not wake up from this. He wakes up from the commotion of the roommates on the 3rd floor who hear what's going on clamoring down rather than what they originally heard to be woken up.
So his claim is going to be, the reason I didn't hear this, even though it was happening much closer to me than it was to Price and Zaborski, I took a sleeping pill. So his excuse is, look, I took a sleeping pill that knocked me out. Now, interestingly, he didn't stay asleep. He did wake up. You know, Zaborski and Joe running around did wake him up, but the sounds of the murder didn't. Sort of take that for what you will.
Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. 1 purchased equals 1 donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
So later that day, Deputy Medical Examiner Lois Goslanowski performed an autopsy on Robert. And she found, quote, 3 remarkably clean, symmetrical, uniform stab wounds to Mr. Wong's torso. The first stab wound was at the central upper chest, the second on the right side of the chest, and the third in the abdomen. Each wound was inflicted at precisely the same angle, with no defects, appearing very methodical. According to Dr. Goslanowski's findings, quote, the stab wounds damaged major vascular areas and organs and have resulted in a large quantity of blood flowing out of Mr. Wong's body, far in excess of the relatively small spots of blood found on the guest room bed. Goslanowski also found that a significant amount of internal bleeding occurred as a result of the stab wounds, with blood filling the intestine. This indicates that Wong was alive for a considerable amount of time after he was stabbed, quote, as his digestive system continued to operate.
So this is huge, right? If you believe her statement and you think she got this right, then the roommates are involved. Just as simple as that. Because what she's describing, I just keep going back to Bone Valley because it's our most recent case we did with the stabbing and a lot of blood. And what was the question? Where's the blood? Why isn't there blood in the trailer? Why is there a bunch of blood in some other location if she was killed in the trailer? And here you have this doctor saying, absolutely, you stab somebody like this, there's going to be blood all over the place. And yet you don't see that. If you've seen the crime scene photos, there's a little bit of blood. If you've watched a documentary, there's a little bit of blood. There's not what you would expect here. You know, I've told this story before, but my dog had cut his ear one time and it was bleeding. And he did that. He was wet and I took him into the bathroom to kind of take care of it. And he did that thing that dogs do where they do their bodies back and forth and his ear flopped up and down. And there was blood everywhere from this one little cut. Imagine you're stabbing someone to death and you're jerking that knife out and you're stabbing them again and you're stabbing them in the chest, in the arteries, in the heart, but they're still alive and that blood is still pumping. What are you going to see? You're going to see blood all over the place, but you don't see that. Now you do see some blood in the cavity, the body cavity, in his intestines. And the fight that you're eventually going to have between experts is you have the medical examiner who says, there should have been blood outside the body. You should have seen a lot of bleeding. Then you're going to have the defense expert who's going to come in and say, and it's Dr. Henry Lee, who's going to come in and say, no, all the blood went into his body, and that's why you don't see this. And it's one of those things that it's hard. The problem I have, and we'll talk about this more later, but Dr. Lee, he's famous for a lot of different cases, but on our podcast, he's probably most famous for Michael Peterson. And what did he talk about in Michael Peterson? He talked about cast-off. And he talked about how, and this is the thing, and this is what we do when we have experts in cases. One of the things we do is we read their prior testimony. And why do we do that? Because when they testify to something at trial, we want to be able to say, haven't you said before that when you have a stabbing, you're going to see cast-off, right? And he talks about, in that case, it's more of a beating, but nevertheless, it's a beating that is putting blood on the item. And he's saying, if you had that, if you have down and up and there's blood, you're going to see cast off behind the body. That's what you're going to see. And you don't see that in the Michael Peterson case. And because you don't see that, it's inconsistent with a beating. Well, here, even if most of the blood stayed in the body, you don't see the cast off you should expect from those 3 stab wounds. There should be patterns of blood somewhere, at least from the knife, even if you buy the other part, and you don't see that. And it is the blood in this case. In many ways, like in Bone Valley, the blood or the absence thereof is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence, and something we're going to come back to. But when you read the findings of the pathologist, if she's got this right, then there is no question that somebody in the house did this. And why do we know that? Because there would have had to have been a lot of cleanup done in a way that there's no way it could have happened with an intruder and these 3 people not know about it. It's impossible for that to have happened and these 3 people not to have known about it if you had that amount of cleanup. Okay, so during the autopsy, Alice, you did such a good job of pronouncing this lady's name, and now I've got to do
I
the same.
practiced so many times.
Oh, there you go.
Goslinowski.
Goslinowski.
I don't know if it's right, but it flowed from my tongue.
So during the autopsy, Goslinowski also found petechial hemorrhage in both eyes, which would be consistent with some type of asphyxial event. So a lot of you know when someone strangles you or you are strangled, there are a few things you can look for to see that. The obvious is like bruising around the neck, but if it results in death, you often won't see that because it takes a while for bruises to form. The other one is you can have fractures of the hyoid bone. That is more common in people who are older because your hyoid bone starts off very sort of flexible and then becomes more and more brittle as you get older. The other thing you see, though, is this petechial hemorrhage, which is basically the blood vessels in your eye, because of stress and pressure, are bursting, and you can look at the eyes and you can see that. And this is something that tends to happen from strangling or something along those lines. So you have this situation where you're seeing that in the eyes. So just to recount some of the weird things we're seeing, you're seeing 3 symmetrical, methodical, remarkably clean, uniform stab wounds. Same depth, same width. No tearing, no cutting, just in and out, right? You're seeing that, which seems strange. You're not seeing a whole lot of blood, which seems strange. And now you're seeing something that seems to indicate some sort of strangulation, but at the same time, you're not seeing any indication of manual strangulation. So you don't see any marks on the neck. You don't see the hyoid bone broken, though, once again, people always think the hyoid bone is always broken in strangulations and that it's only broken in strangulations. Both of those things are false, but you're not seeing it nonetheless. So you sort of have an absence of evidence of strangulation except for the eyes, and you certainly don't see any kind of struggle. So now you've got a situation in which you are to believe that there may have been some sort of strangulation event at some point, and there may have been, well, there definitely was a stabbing, 3 stab wounds, and yet the victim didn't struggle, didn't move, no defensive wounds. Not only no defensive wounds, the bed is not messed up. He is described as laying in this bed just perfectly. You know, the perfect little crease of his head in the pillow. I mean, it is just stunning that you could have these kind of injuries on a person and yet have no indication that they were actually injured. If you couldn't look at his body and see these things, you would think he died peacefully in his sleep. But obviously that didn't happen. And how do you bring those two things together? You have these 2 facts that seem absolutely incompatible, and yet you see them in this case.
No, this all comes down to this, right? This is really interesting because we obviously have this autopsy, and unfortunately, this is one of those cases where I really wish we had a doctor with us, because I have some questions about alternative readings of the autopsy report. I'm not saying that Dr. Goslinowski got it wrong or anything, but I think there are so many unknowns that clearly, even the way that Goslinowski's report is read, can't medically be true. Right? I mean, there's something that is missing. And obviously, Goslinowski is just looking at whatever is in front of her, and she has limited information, right? And so I'm not saying that her report's wrong, but the way that she describes of what happens, there are just so many missing puzzle pieces that are very difficult to understand. And I did a lot of poking into medical journals that we'll talk about later, but this is truly one of those reports that boggles the mind.
It really does, and it gets weirder. So you've got Goslinowski, who's going to look at this bloody knife, obviously. And one thing she notes about it is she measures the blade, and it's 5.5 inches long. But, and we've talked about this a little bit and foreshadowed this a little bit, the depth of each stab wound measures between 4 and 5 inches long. So you've got some that are about 4 inches long, some that are about 5. The ones that are 5 inches, about 1/2 inch shorter, not as deep as the length of the knife. The ones that are 4 inches, that's 1.5 inches. That's pretty significant. Now you may be thinking, what's 1.5 inches? But as we've said before, if you believe this is a stabbing, remember what someone's doing. And another thing that's important to note, we don't see any hesitation marks on this body. So whoever did this, when they decided to stab him, they went for it. You know, they didn't start off with hesitation and then stab him. That didn't happen. They went for it. But you would have to believe this person took the knife, stabbed someone in the chest, but did not do it with enough force to drive the knife all the way into the chest. And as we've said before, and we said on the last episode, that is not typical. Typically, you can have a 5.5 inch long knife and see a 6 inch or a 6.5 inch wound, because the knife will actually go further into the body than the blade. To have this not go in all the way is another very strange fact you have in this case, and it's one that led her to conclude that it was just unlikely that this was the knife, which is a strange thing to say because it's sitting next to him, it's got blood on it, and yet it doesn't seem to line up with the wounds. It's not so dramatic that you could say it's impossible the knife made the wounds. It's not that. It's not like, you know, it was a Rambo-style knife on the bedside and, you know, scalpel-sized wounds on him. It's not that. But it's enough that somebody who's seen a lot of stabbings and seen a lot of cases like this is going to say, look, this just isn't consistent with what you would normally see. And that's something that we deal with a lot in cases, because people want to draw really strong conclusions, and I totally get that. I want to draw them too, because it makes life much more black and white. You don't normally see that in cases with experts. You very rarely have an expert who says, that's what did it, or that didn't do it. You have, it's consistent with it, it's not consistent with it. And that's what you're seeing here. You have a doctor who is reaching a conclusion based on her experience and based on what she's seeing that these wounds are not really consistent with the knife. Not impossible, but certainly very strange if this is the knife that caused the wounds.
And kind of one thing to note about that, of course, the 5.5 inch blade could make a 4 to 5 inch long puncture. However, you don't have, a measuring tape looking at 1.5 inches shorter than what your blade is, yet all 3 wounds are stopping short of about 1.5 inches from the end of this blade. That's a lot of precision. That's typically why you see the length of the blade or a little bit more as the depth of a particular wound, because you're not measuring there as you stab down, right? You just stab down and usually stop at your fist. And that's why this is so interesting. Of course, there is a world where a longer blade can make a shorter puncture wound, but the fact that all of the 3 puncture wounds are nearly identical in their depth makes it highly unlikely that a person who has human error and probably no ruler that they're using to measure the depth of these wounds as the knife is going in and having to stop short of the butt of the blade is very unlikely, which is why I think her conclusion is really consistent with what we see often in stabbings as well.
And the one thing I'll say about this, the last thing I'll say about the stabbings, and I'll move on because I feel like I'm dwelling on this because I find it to be just so surprising. The other thing you typically see in a stabbing is you just don't see these kind of clean wounds. This reminds me of the Jeffrey McDonald case. You may recall Jeffrey McDonald had a very precise stab wound in his chest that nicked his lung and caused his lung to collapse. And the theory there was that he had taken a scalpel and stabbed himself in the chest to create this wound to help him cover up the murder. Usually you don't see stabbings that are that precise when it is a violent encounter, when it's a murder. So you're going to see tearing. You're going to see all sorts of evidence in the wound, from things like we talked about, like if the knife goes in too far. I mean, when the handle starts going into your body, it's going to make a different mark on your body than the stab wound. You would see stuff like that to see this kind of clean, precise stabbing, and to assume that it happened in an attack. It just doesn't make sense. It's just not consistent with what you would expect to see. And it's one of those things where if that's what happened, it is a very strange murder.
But Brett, you're going to get into this. This next part is what kind of really blows my mind, because it's not just the stab wounds that are weird on him.
Those are not the only wounds that he has. Gosanowski will also note several needle puncture marks on Robert's body. Several are on the left side of his neck, 3 are in the center of his chest, 2 in his right foot, and 1 on the back of his left hand. EMS workers and medical personnel will confirm that these marks were not caused by any medical treatment they performed. Additionally, they appear to have been performed pre-mortem, at least some of them. making it impossible for the EMS workers to have caused the marks because, as we know, Robert was dead when they found him. And though they attempted to revive him, it was pretty much a lost cause at that point. Robert's wife would confirm that he had no doctor appointments in the weeks prior to the murder, which could have caused these. And so you may be thinking, well, he was drugged, right? Somebody drugged him. And so they ran toxicology reports, and they came back with nothing. No drugs showed up in Robert's system. Now, there are, interestingly, some paralytic drugs, some which are not that uncommon, particularly in the medical field, which tests would not reveal because of the way they metabolize in the body even after death. So those tests weren't even run. They didn't even bother to run those tests because you can't actually test for those drugs. So no recreational drugs in his body, no alcohol in his body. No, this wasn't a heroin overdose or a fentanyl overdose or a cocaine overdose or anything like that. But there are certain paralytics which, if they had been injected into his body, would not result in a positive test. And when you think about what we've seen up to this point, what might initially seem like a pretty extreme claim that some sort of paralytic was administered to Robert starts to feel more and more like it's a possibility.
So maybe most notably, Goslinowski was able to determine that none of the knife wounds would have killed or even rendered Mr. Wong unconscious immediately, unless otherwise incapacitated. In other words, by being injected with some type of incapacitating or paralytic drug. Mr. Wong would have reacted instinctively to protect himself and or physically fend off his attacker. But, as we've already said, Robert had no defensive wounds of any kind and little to no blood on his hands, indicating he didn't even clutch his hands to his chest at the time of the stabbing or immediately after the attack, as would be a natural human response. Finally, Goslinowski completed a rape kit for Wong. Now, there was evidence to suggest that Robert may have been sexually assaulted, but this was not able to be determined conclusively. At first, everyone got exorcised because there was semen found on and in his body. But when they ran the semen to see if they could identify whose it was, this is like a twist of all twists, right? The semen came back as Robert's own semen. And there was no other semen on him from other DNA. And again, it's not just on him, like topically, but they found some inside of him. I don't know if you know how biology works, Brett, but I think where his own semen was found would have been physically impossible without another agent to facilitate the process of moving semen to that area of his body.
And, this is one of those moments where you see somebody on a documentary and you wonder how they could say something and not think about the words that are coming out of their mouths. If you've seen The Murder of Robert Wone, when this comes out, the defense attorney for the three gentlemen who lived in this apartment tries to say, well, don't know what happened there, but clearly it wasn't a rape because, this is impossible to happen without your consent. Which is just not true. just as a matter of simple fact, that's just not true. Can't believe that guy said that. Don't know why he would say that. It is certainly possible that, for instance, if Robert were somehow incapacitated, could not move, could not defend himself, that someone else could have caused him to ejaculate, and then they find his semen on his body. As Alice said, it's unlikely that if he was doing this on his own, you would find it everywhere they found it, which makes you think somebody else had to be involved in this. Now, the problem with that, as we've said before, there are a couple things. Number one, what did Robert say he was going to do right before he went to bed? He was going to take a shower. So, one theory you might imagine is, they can't really tell you when this happened. Maybe it was he just never took a shower. He and his wife done whatever the night before, and then you see this. Well, he said he was going to take a shower. Number two, there was actually testimony at trial that his habit, particularly on hot nights, which this was to always take a shower before he went to bed. So he says he's going to take a shower, and it's his habit. And the paramedics said it looked like he had taken a shower when they found him. So the chances that this is somehow old, unlikely. This seems like this came from something that happened that night. But the problem is, they don't find any other evidence of this. And the police exhaustively search that apartment. You know, they find a lot of paraphernalia for sort of an S&M type relationship that apparently everybody else in this apartment was involved in. Test it all. Don't find any DNA of Robert's. Don't find any evidence that any of those items were used that night. But it seems like something happened where Robert was essentially sexually assaulted, probably against his will. Why would you think that? Because when he was found with his mouth guard in. The last thing he would put in his mouth before he went to sleep. Two things that are hard to believe. I mean, number one, it's hard to believe that in the very short period of time between when he got there and then, you know, he took a shower, he went to bed, he was like, oh, you know, I might be in my friend's house, but I'm going to go ahead and have some fun games with myself while I'm laying in the bed, and then I'm going to pop my mouth guard in, and then someone shows up and stabs me to death. How inconvenient. It also seems unlikely that if he was having any sort of consensual sexual activity with anyone else in the apartment, that he would be doing it with his mouth guard in. So there are these things, as we've said, there are so many inconsistencies in this story. Whatever story you try and create to make all of these facts line up, very few of them work unless you start to go down that path that some sort of paralytic was used and that Robert was in a position where he could not resist either a sexual assault or a murder.
Right. So I started this off with saying that Goslanowski said that none of the knife wounds would have killed Mr. Wong, but ultimately, Dr. Goslanowski still ruled that the stab wounds would be the cause of death and the manner of death to be homicide, which in this type of a report, you just got to say, like, obviously.
Yes. This wasn't an accident.
I mean, obviously.
Now,
but
if this were Philadelphia,
how?
This would have been a suicide. Yeah, they would have said, oh, he stabbed himself to death. Yeah, that would have been what happened. But
no, but here's the thing. Despite all of us nodding our heads and saying clearly this was a homicide, unfortunately, it would be years before there would be any arrests made relating to Robert's murder.
But they would be made eventually, because this case is going to get weird. Now, one thing that's interesting about this that a lot of y'all may not know, in most states, and we talk about this a lot, most states, you have two types of prosecutors, really three types of prosecutors. You have local prosecutors who have a sort of a small area that they cover. You have state prosecutors who work for the Attorney General's office, and they'll often be called into complicated cases, maybe where the locals don't have a lot of familiarity with that kind of crime, or it's a big thing where they don't have the resources. So you have a small town that has a complex murder. A lot of times the state's going to come in, they're going to help investigate, they're going to help prosecute. Imagine what you saw in the Murdaugh case. You know, despite the fact that you also had some recusals, you probably weren't going to have the local guy try and prosecute that case. It was much better to have the AG's office come in and do that. But the third kind are assistant United States attorneys, who are federal prosecutors who prosecute federal crimes. Oftentimes, murders, almost always, murders are prosecuted by local and state prosecutors. Murder is not a federal crime unless it is tied to a few things: murder for hire, or, you know, a mob murder, or a murder motivated by certain, you know, hate crime type murders, something like that, terrorism that results in death. Unless it's something like that, your federal prosecutors are not going to prosecute murder, except in the District of Columbia, which is not a state. And in the District of Columbia, the United States Attorney, they're the ones who prosecute these crimes. There is a division of the D.C. United States Attorney's Office that prosecutes murders. And in Robert's case, one of the sort of most famous, sophisticated prosecutors is going to handle this case. And if you've seen Who Killed Robert Wone, there's a lot of, he's a big focus. There's a big focus on the prosecutor and on the defense. They're the ones who are going to handle this. And one thing that's interesting is, this crime happened in 2007. By 2008, sort of the end of 2008, there's a presidential election, and Barack Obama is going to be elected, and Eric Holder is going to be his attorney general. And Eric Holder was a partner at Covington, which is where Robert Wone had worked. And so this was sort of a personal thing for him. And while he was still a partner, but while he's on the way to being attorney general, makes it very clear he wants this investigated. He wants this crime to be solved. And who oversees the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office? The Attorney General. So it's not surprising that in late 2008, you have Dylan Ward arrested. Not for murder, though. He's arrested for obstruction of justice. Now, here's something that's interesting that I want to talk about with Alice. They made a strategic decision. There were 3 people in that house, right? So you had Dylan Ward. He was on the 2nd floor. He was the one in the bedroom right as you came up the steps. You had Victor Zaborski, who made the 911 call. We're going to listen to that 911 call probably at the beginning of the next episode. And you had Joseph Price, who was one of Robert's oldest friends, who was in the room with Victor when this supposedly happened. Alice, if you had to pick one of these people to arrest in the hopes that they broke and told what happened, who would you have picked?
Not who they picked.
Not who they picked.
I would have picked Victor Zaborski.
I would have too.
Because his story is the farthest removed from being with Robert, right? He's even claiming, and we always say, even in lies, if anyone's lying, there's going to be a touch of truth. And if he had seen Robert that night, that's a pretty big lie to say you never even saw Robert come into your home because you were asleep. So I actually do believe that Victor didn't see him until things had gone down. And so he has everything to lose and probably the least to do with whatever happened, because he's the one who also called 911. So if we're going to try to pin obstruction of justice or something on one of the 3, unlikely that it's really going to be the person who stepped out of line, quote unquote, of the cone of silence, if that's what you think happened, to call 911 and bring in the police. Right? He's the one who is sounding freaked out on the phone. Emotion matters. Already highly nervous. Basically saying to police, I had nothing to do with this, on a different floor. I walked into this horrific thing. We'll talk about whose scream that is. I think there's a very high possibility that scream was Victor's scream, meaning there's an element of shock there. So my number one person to flip, and we do this all the time, guys. We work on conspiracies. We work on like drug trafficking organizations all the time. And we make these strategic calls on who to flip. It's not always the highest and it's not always the lowest. It's not always the middle guy. You have to read your witness of who's the weakest. And to me, he was the one to arrest first, and he would have been the highest probability to flip. And also, he wasn't best friends with Robert.
This was a tough call, and I hate to criticize because hindsight's 20/20, but I was very surprised at who they picked. I was very surprised that they would pick Dylan Ward. Now, the reason I think they picked him, remember back, I think we talked about this. If we haven't talked about it before, we're going to talk about it later, but I think we did. When the 3 of them were initially questioned by police, who did all the talking? It was Joseph Price. He did all the talking. At one point, Dylan Ward started to talk. Joseph Price looked at him and gave him a look, and Ward stopped talking. And I think what they decided was Ward wanted to talk. The reason he didn't talk was because of Joe Price. Maybe if we bring him in now, he'll tell us everything. One of the major problems I have with this is it's difficult to know exactly who did this, but of the 3 of them, Dylan Ward's a pretty good suspect. He is probably the best suspect if you think one of them killed Robert. If you think that, why would you bring him in? Even if he had this propensity to talk in the beginning. I agree with you 100%, Alice. They should have brought in Victor. And I am surprised
and to close
that
the
they
loop,
didn't.
the reason I don't think that Joe was, I agree with you completely, just based on opportunity of distance, Dylan was the closest in proximity to Robert, if you think it's one of the three. The reason you don't bring in Joe first is he's clearly at least external facing, the ringleader facing the police of the three of them, and he's the closest to Robert. So whatever happened, whether you think Joe did it or not, his very close personal relationship with Robert causes people to lie even when they had nothing to do with it. You need someone just removed enough who had nothing to do with it, be the first to flip. And that person just seems so obvious to me. It's Victor. Even before I found out who they arrested first, I was like, oh, good. They arrested one person to try and get them to flip. Of course, it's Victor. And as soon as I said like out loud, Victor, they're like, so they arrested Dylan Ward. And I was like, why? Why would you do that?
Yeah. And the thing about Joe, Joe is one of Robert's oldest friends. If Joe is involved in this or knows anything, if him flipping could help you, he's already decided he's never going to do that. The fact that he hasn't helped you at this point means that he's decided to betray that lifelong friendship, not only with Robert, but with Robert's wife and everyone who loved Robert. He has already betrayed that. He's never going to tell you anything. He is always going to be silent. So he's obvious. You're not going to talk to him. It's either going to be Victor or Dylan Ward. But I like you. I am shocked that they picked Dylan Ward. But they did pick Dylan Ward, and they tried to get him to break. And wouldn't you know it, he doesn't break. So with that not happening, they've decided they're all in on this. They go ahead and arrest Victor and Joseph Price, and they're also charged with obstruction of justice. And the theory of this case is pretty interesting. It's basically, if we had to prove a murder, we couldn't do it because we believe one of these three did it, but we can't tell you which one. I mean, one of them did it, and it's almost the strategy of the prosecution. This is a fascinating case from a prosecution point of view. The strategy of the prosecution is prove there was a murder that wasn't committed by an intruder. So prove that one of them did it. Now that you know one of them did it, prove that it's impossible that the other three could have been in that house when one of them did it, been in the house after one of them did it, and not know, and not help cover it up in some way or another. So if one of them did it, what are the things that would have had to have happened? There would have had to have been cleanup. There would have had to have been staging of the scene to make it look like an intruder. Like all these things would have had to have happened. And it's hard to believe that all this is happening while one of them is still asleep and the other two are doing it. That was the strategy and the theory the prosecution was going for, because they did not feel like they could prove that any particular person killed him. But if one of them did it, all three of them had to have covered it up. That was the theory that they were going to go with. At the same time, Catherine, who is Robert's wife, brings a $20 million wrongful death suit against the three men. This is in 2008. Takes a while. These guys got money. Like we said, they're living in one of the nicest places in D.C. They hire the best defense attorneys. They hire the best experts. This probably was the most money ever spent on an obstruction of justice case, which is typically a one-day trial, right? If you even have a trial, you just deal with it sentencing. But this is all out because really, this is a murder trial dressed up as obstruction of justice. And they decide, and actually learn something from the documentary, they decide to do a bench trial. So they have a bench trial for these three guys that will be decided by a DC judge. They are going to make the decision, not some jury. And as we said, they're charged with obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. Here's something I learned. In the federal system, the prosecution can object to a bench trial. I did some research about this. This is not true in every state. In a lot of states, you just have the right to do a bench trial. But I was really surprised by that you could object. Did you know that?
I did not know that, because it seems to be the right of the defendant to assert.
I know. Because you have a right to a jury. You should be able to waive that right. And who am I to say you have to have a jury? But apparently you can do that. You can object. And if you object, then the judge has to decide that there's sort of like special considerations that make a bench trial more in the interest of justice than a jury trial. And I looked up the rule, and sure enough, that's what it says. I was shocked. When they were talking about it, I was like, that's not true. And then I looked it up, and it is true. So I learned something about the law.
That's the beauty of the law, Brett. We literally cannot know everything about the law in all the jurisdictions.
It's so true.
We will forever be learning.
And let me just tell you, this is another lesson. Whenever you're watching lawyers on television or doing whatever, and they act like they know everything, they absolutely do not. They do not. It is a myth.
The more I practice, the more that I realize my slice of knowledge of the law shrinking because I realize all of the pie that I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. And we will always admit that. And it's so fascinating. Like you talk about, we always try and use the federal law as a benchmark because it's across all the states, and you guys, no matter where you are, but it's just amazing. We do these cases in states, and we are always discovering these weird quirks in each state and how they do things. It's fascinating. Anyway, so they're going to have a bench trial.
And by the way, if I were them, I totally would want a bench trial because obviously you guys have heard the facts so far. That's exactly what the jury would hear. And I think at a guttural response is like, the three of you were in a house with a fourth person who ended up murdered in the most bizarre of kind of autopsies that I've seen. The kind of gut reaction for a lot of people, I would think, in a jury is, I don't know what you had to do with it, but it sounds like you had something to do with it. So this obstruction of justice thing probably fits. I don't know which one, but one of you did. Which is why I think it was smart of them to go with a judge rather than a jury, because the jury may use emotion and they're allowed to. They're a black box, right? We don't get access to their reasoning. But the judge has to explain why the judge reaches the decision, and it's appealable, right? They have to explain legally what is the basis for their decision.
And I think you're so right about that, and I just don't want to let that go without saying how right you are. I think this theory the prosecution came up with would have been so attractive to a jury, because it's like, I don't know which one of y'all did it, but y'all clearly all were involved. Guilty, right? And you really want a judge who's going to be much more careful and thoughtful about that. And I think that's what the defense was thinking when they decided to go with a jury trial in this case.
And we haven't even talked about all the other optics around it, right? I mean, I know this is not today, but it was still in the 2000s. You bet your bottom dollar that in a jury trial, all the different interplay of the relationships among these three men who were in a polyamorous relationship would come out. DC is a very progressive place, and they could be totally okay with polyamorous relationships, but you don't know how that's going to cut when it comes to someone dead in your own house, right? So it could cut lots of different ways. A judge has to kind of leave out all of the character assessments or judgments of what these people's sexual behaviors were.
And let me say this. Another thing that's really interesting, and you see this in the documentary if you read any of the stuff, there's some websites out there that do a great job sort of chronicling this whole case. The gay community in DuPont Circle did not line up behind these three. There was a lot of hostility that was basically like, you guys don't know what you did, but you're ruining this community. This is a terrible thing. You're bringing sort of disrepute on this community. So there was nobody that was sympathetic to these guys sort of in the DC community. I think finding a jury that would not have been very ready to convict them would have been really hard.
Absolutely. DC Superior Court Judge Lynn Leibovitz heard this trial. She was the sole arbiter in this trial. And after the trial of all three men who were charged with tampering with the evidence and obstruction of justice, despite everything you heard here, acquitted all three men of all charges. But remember what we said about a judge bench trial. She has to explain her reasoning. And boy, did she explain. In her opinion that supported the acquittal of all three men, she was very clear, unequivocal, that she did not believe the men's intruder story, and she was skeptical that they were not involved in Robert's death. She said, quote, "In the ordinary decisions we make in our daily lives, a person who believes something strongly, but without evidentiary support beyond a reasonable doubt, may still be correct in her belief and responsible in her decision-making. But to convict an accused, a trier of fact must be firmly convinced based on evidentiary certainty." Who she's talking about in that first part of that paragraph was herself. She's saying, I think you did it. And I think I could be right even without the evidence. But I'm not just a person. I'm the trier of fact. And I am bound by the laws, the evidentiary standards that I've pledged to. And because of that, this doesn't meet the evidentiary standard to find you guilty. I mean, this is a hard decision for her to make.
Yes. And let me say this. This opinion is it's a masterclass in describing reasonable doubt and how reasonable doubt works. Because in the opinion, you essentially have, as Alice summed up there in a couple sentences, the judge repeatedly saying at various times, she thinks these guys did it, all were involved, know who did it. She believes that. But she could not get there beyond a reasonable doubt, and she explains that. And we're going to put this opinion up on the website, prosecutorspodcast.com. I hope you'll read it because it's worth reading. We're actually going to spend a lot of time going through the various findings and factual findings in this in the next episode, because one of the great things about having a bench trial, as Alice said, it's not just jury comes in, guilty, not guilty. You get a whole recitation of the facts, what facts she found, why she found them, how she applied them to the law. And so you have just this great document from someone trained to find facts, who does it every day, laying out for you what the best arguments are for the various things that we've already talked about. So we're going to go through all that. But if you have an opportunity to read this opinion, it's not long. I mean, it's longish, but it's not super long. Read it. You will learn a lot.
And there are times where justice may not be done with a conviction, but justice may be done in illuminating to the loved ones, in this case, Kathy Wong, what a judge who's seen all the evidence thinks happened, right? Kathy doesn't have an answer in terms of what really happened. She's not going to get it so far from these three men, because really they're probably the only ones who can shed some light on what happened. And so far they haven't said anything that's helpful. But in some ways, this legal opinion is directed at Robert's loved ones to give some clarity into what likely happened. And
it's also interesting because another thing that it does is it sort of pours out judgment in a way on these three men and brings sort of, the judgment of the community on them. The notion that we all know you did this. We don't know you did this enough to put you in prison because we don't have that level of certainty. But she talks about the difference between a moral certainty and a legal certainty. It's a fascinating piece of work, and one of the least acquittals you'll ever read. But obviously it wasn't just a criminal case. The civil case was also ongoing.
That's right. So the acquittal came in June of 2010. And remember, there was simultaneously a civil wrongful death action brought by Robert's wife, Catherine. And in August of 2011, that did not go to trial. Rather, a settlement was reached in Kathy Wong's wrongful death suit. And though those details and the amount of settlement were not disclosed, which is pretty typical in settlement cases, what we do know is that the three men will make monetary payments to the Robert Wong Memorial Trust for scholarships and legal services. And we know that from reports about the settlement. And I think after the settlement, Kathy gave a press conference. She typically does not speak very often in public, but she decided to speak up in this particular case about why she didn't take this case to trial and how she wanted to move on with her life from really the horrific past few years that she had to live through and find some peace moving forward.
All right. So that's the end of the story, but there's a lot more to talk about. Next week, we're going to dive into the opinion of the court. We're going to dive into what was discovered at trial. We're going to play the 911 call for you so you can hear it. It is worth listening to. And I think once we get finished with some of this, you'll have a pretty good idea of what happened here. And you'll also see some misconceptions about this case, including things that we've talked about. We kind of have told you the story as it's always told. The truth is a little bit more complex in certain areas. And so we're going to get into that as well and sort of give you the real facts, as it were, and hopefully get you closer to having an opinion on this case. This is one of the wildest, craziest mysteries. I mean, this is one of those where it is amazing that you could know so much and yet not know the final answer. We have so many facts, so many details, so many strange things, but we're missing just a couple pieces of information that if we had them, might give us finality on that. Question time. I love question time. Once again, if you're unfamiliar with this, when we finish our regular episode, we've started a new tradition of answering reviewers' questions. If you want to have a question and you want it answered, all you have to do is leave a 5-star review on Apple, or leave it anywhere else, or send us a question if you leave a 5-star. Whatever you want to do, we will take care of it and answer your questions. And that's what we're doing now. Okay. So let's see. I'm just going to go to the first one and see. Okay, Chloe wants to know, after becoming an attorney, what are your chances of actually being able to sit on a jury? One of my professors said, as soon as he is called for jury duty, he gets dismissed. She's going to be an attorney, but she wants to sit on a jury so bad. We've talked about this a little bit before. If you're a lawyer and you want to be on a jury, your best bet is to move to D.C. It doesn't mean that you'll be picked, but if you live in D.C., everybody's a lawyer in D.C., so if you get called, being a lawyer usually will not get you struck from jury duty, because if that did, there wouldn't be any jurors.
Yeah, there's no bar on serving on a jury if you're an attorney. It's just that one side, either the plaintiff or the defendant, is going to not want you on the case because you'll either overthink things or maybe you'll know the law too well, that sort of thing. But all my friends in D.C. basically have been called for grand jury or petite jury, and there's just not enough non-lawyers in the city to populate all the juries. So I would say the larger cities where there are a lot of attorneys, New York City, DC, LA, has a lot of attorneys as well. It's not a complete bar. And it depends the type of attorney you are. If you're like, a M&A lawyer, a corporate lawyer who does like mergers and acquisitions, you very well might get to sit on an assault case, for example.
Yeah.
Because it has nothing to do with your area.
That's a good point. If you're a prosecutor or a defense attorney, which most lawyers aren't, it's harder to get on a jury. But yeah, if you're doing corporate work, what difference does it make? You'll probably be just as open-minded as anybody else. Okay, next question. Which of you writes the transcript, and how do you decide which of you takes each part? Well, I wouldn't call it a transcript. It's more of an outline. We just sort of have an outline. We both contribute to it. It's on the Google Drive. Madison obviously contributes a lot as well because she's awesome. She's helping us with research. And then how do we decide who takes each part? Alice takes all the good parts, and then I take whatever is left over. So
the reality is, so we don't have a transcript. We're not reading a script. No kidding, guys. That we would stumble a lot less and get a lot fewer 1-star reviews about how we can't speak words if we were reading a script. But we have kind of guideposts of where we want to cover so that we're kind of on the same page. But I don't know, Brett, we just gel really well as well. We don't practice. This is not rehearsed. This is a real-time conversation. If you guys, none of you are here listening to us, this would be the conversation we'd be having. I think that's why this podcast works. But they're guideposts to help guide us into, making sure we cover the points that we have. Obviously, we will want to get quotes right. We'll have the quotes there, citations, that sort of thing. But otherwise, it's a pretty natural kind of conversation. We start the conversation and then the spirit moves us.
The spirit moves us. Let's see. Listener 954 says, regarding your opening and closing music. I don't even know what they're going to say after that, but that's why I picked it because of that.
It better be good, though.
I've wondered, Brett, if you love this song so much that you actually thought, I'm going to make a podcast and have this music as my opening, and then came up with Prosecutors with Alice. No, I can't say that I found the song first. So it's just so...
It came very close to the beginning.
It did. It did. And look, I can't believe we're closing in on 4 years, Alice. 4 years.
I feel old.
That we've been doing this.
How is that even possible?
By this time, it was basically 4 years ago that we picked the music, actually.
You're right, because it's February, and we recorded our first episode on March 12th.
We did.
Right? Or like 11th, something like that. It was the week that the world shut down because of the pandemic.
One of our one-star reviews,
one episode together,
which we'll eventually read, is criticizing us for joking about COVID. Because when we recorded that episode, it was before the COVID really got serious. It was before it was a pandemic. Yeah. We were recording together. That was like the first episode we recorded together. And then from that point on, we had to record remotely, which worked out. It worked out great. Actually,
it never would have had such longevity.
There's no way. If we had to coordinate being in the same room, no way. It never would have worked. But it did. So basically, we decided around this time that we're going to do this podcast. And then I was in the kitchen. I remember being in the kitchen listening to that song for the first time and being like, I think this is the one.
We independently picked this, right? Because we had 4 song things, and you had one, but you didn't influence my decision. You're like, which one of these 4 do you like? And me and Mr. Alice listened to it, and it was the second one we listened to. And I was like, I don't want to hear the other 2. This is the one I want.
This is the one.
And when I texted you and Mrs. Brett, I was like, this is the one. And you were like, thank God, that was the one I wanted.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So that's how we picked the song. Okay, well, I think that's all we'll answer for tonight. But if you guys have other questions, like I said, leave us a 5-star review, leave us a question, and we will answer it. If you have thoughts on this case or any other case, let us know. Prosecutors Pod for all your social media, including, as we've said several times, we're now on TikTok. Our new thing that we're doing, which seems to be pretty popular, is reading 1-star reviews, which is a lot of fun. I get a kick out of it. I'm hoping you guys are enjoying it as well. This is not encouraging you to leave them.
I hope this doesn't encourage people to go.
Right. Exactly.
Leave 1-star
Somebody
reviews.
said in a comment, they were like, I want to leave a 1-star review just so they'll read it. But no, it's not going to work that way. Though you can.
Remember, you can leave a 5-star review and ask a question, and then we will actually talk and engage with you.
Or you can leave a 5-star review that's really mean, and we'll just treat that as a 1-star review. So you can do that as well. But check us out there. If you have a case request, send us an email. That is the way to do it. DMs are great. Tweets are great. Facebook's great. But if you want to recommend a case, it is so much better if you send it in email, because then I can just forward it to Madison, who adds it to the case list, which is eternally long, but we're working through. So send us an email to do that. And I just want to say another thank you to all our patrons. Y'all are amazing. Y'all support us despite the fact that these recordings are often a disaster, like this one was tonight. Like 100 of you are still here an hour and a half in when we had all sorts of technical issues and everything else. We love you guys. The positivity of everybody is amazing, and we're so happy to do these lives and record these lives with you and somebody. And people always bring up stuff in the chat. The email address, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. I didn't say that. Somebody in the chat caught that for me, so thank you very much. All right, Alice, is there anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, but this case, you think it's been interesting. It's just about to get even more interesting. So I hope you join us next time.
You will learn things. If you listen to the next episode or two, you will learn things about this case that you didn't know. I promise you that. All right, Alice, so we'll be back next week with more on the Robert Wone case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. I might just turn this off because it's so weird. It sounds so weird to me that I can't.
Oh, you can hear yourself and it sounds weird.
Yeah, that's the problem. 'Cause it's like, it just sounds weird to me. So
okay, you do what you gotta do.
Yeah, let's see how I do that. That doesn't do it. Let's see. All these different little knobs and stuff. Does that do it? That did it. Okay. Okay, so now it's not weird anymore because I can't hear myself. So.
If you ignore the problem, it doesn't exist. Guys, if Brett has the hate hat, I've been trying to think all day.
Oh, wait, no, I can't hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, while you're trying to figure that out, now that you have the hate hat, I've been racking my brain all day
of hate.
Of what I can do. That makes sense. I was thinking of something using Brittany's bib.
Ooh.
Because she has like a bib that catches food, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like catch all the comments, catch all the 1-star reviews.
There you go.